Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Greetings, listeners. I hope that you're having a pleasant day. It is lovely today. I say that every day. I should get some different adjectives, but it is a very nice day here in suburban Chicago. The weather has turned toward the summerly. I actually am wearing a short sleeve shirt and long pants, and it feels a little warm. I may be hot and parched by the time I finish this podcast, but I will endure for you. So, if you missed the last episode, we talked about how to identify issues in your rulebooks, particularly in interpreting comments from rulebook readers. The challenge of interpreting comments from rulebook readers is that they have different priorities than you. They may like something different than you. They may have different dialogue than you. Or one of our rulebook readers, for instance, posted a note at the end of several long comments in which he said, basically, I don't like reading rule books, which presents a challenge then, right? It sort of suggests, well, what are we to make of these interpretations? If he isn't someone who normally learns games by reading rule books, what do I do with his comments then? Are they valuable? If he's not somebody who learns with rule books, do I ignore them entirely? Well, maybe he would have to play our game, although we would make a video. So that's an interesting challenge that's a little outside of what we're talking about here, but it does go to the lesson that you need to know who your rulebook reader is and what background they're bringing to the context. But we've gotten several more comments in the day since I recorded yesterday's episode. Oh, by the way, it is May 1st, so huzzah, welcome to the 5th month of the year. In 2 episodes or so, I will do my update for my 10x10 and my top of the shelf for May. Those are updated on the web already if you can't wait and you want to get over to BoardGameGeek. But since I do have planned this series on rulebooks, I thought I would continue with it rather than cutting it off and maybe you forget what I was talking about last time. So this time, sort of inspired by these comments from this other reader, I wanted to talk a bit about the challenges of writing rulebooks for casual gamers versus rulebooks for hardcore gamers. One of the things we talked about last time was the use of jargon. I encountered this again in a rulebook I was reading today for another designer who was basically going out of his way to not use jargon. That he would, instead of active or inactive, he would use a phrase like available for the player to use, which works once, maybe if you're defining what active or inactive means, but then you should use this shorter word, which is in common parlance, because otherwise the player has to read available for the player to use 25 times in your rulebook. But the line between what a hardcore gamer wants and what a casual gamer wants is also a challenge. And I think mixed into that is the line between what a learner wants and what an experienced player wants out of the rulebook. I'm going to use as my model for this discussion the recent innovations from Fantasy Flight Games regarding how they construct their rulebooks, and particularly for complicated games like both Star Wars Rebellion and Arkham Horror and the revised version of Netrunner all use these modes, which is to have a learning guide and then have a rules reference. So all 3 of those games I mentioned, I'll focus on Arkham Horror because that's the game I maybe know the best, or have played. Well, Netrunner is the game I know the best of the 3, but I didn't learn Netrunner from these rulebooks. I did learn Arkham Horror this way. The way this model works, the presumption is that you're learning how to play the game. You need to know different things in a different order than if you are playing the game and you want to look something up. And so instead of trying to offer one rulebook that does both, Fantasy Flight has started offering 2 rulebooks. They have a Learn to Play guide, which walks you through playing, but also doesn't include all the rules. and then they have a rules reference that includes all the rules, but it's not presented in the order you would need it to learn to play. It's presented in an order that's necessary if you have to look something up. It's entirely alphabetical, for instance. Unfortunately, it also becomes really hard to find all the information you need in the rules reference unless you know it really thoroughly. So one of the experiences I've had with these combination rule books is you end up looking through both. And it's not as effective as I'd like. But it speaks to a problem we're having with the in the loop rule book, and I think I spoke about this yesterday as what I called the chicken and the egg problem of you need to know how to place the different kinds of cards, but unless you know how to place them, but until you understand why you would want to place them, knowing how to place them doesn't make any sense. And learning when to place them or why it doesn't really make much sense until you know how to place them. So it's a problem of a cycle. And the rulebook readers were kind of divided on the results of that cycle. Particularly, they were suggesting that one set of information, which I had put into its own section in the rulebook, should be in the middle of a different section. So to get into particulars, specificity is the soul of narrative after all. In our rulebook, we have a section where it tells you the 4 phases of your turn. And one of those phases, the play phase, has a significant amount of options, or a significant number of options in it. And those options are all need deep explanation. So in terms of formatting the rulebook, our choices were put all of that explanation in to the turn phase section and have that be a pretty substantial break in the middle of this section that's meant to tell you the 4 phases you take on your turn. Or have a whole separate section that just explains these specific things, but it has to be separate from the 4 phases explanation. And actually, this mirrors something I've seen in other rule books, in particular rule books where there are lots of different things you can do. For instance, Anachrony has a whole bunch of different worker spaces you can go to. And in that rule book, it explains your turns, and then one of the things you're doing in your turn is placing workers on action spaces, but it doesn't tell you what the action spaces do until later in the book. Another game I can think of that kind of does this is the game Olympus, which I like quite a bit. In Olympus, you are running a civilization or something, and you have priests, and you place your priests to do actions. And the clever thing with the game is that you can do follow actions as well. So when someone else starts, because the way it was, the actions are divided up by the gods, so there's 12 different actions you can do. And if no one else has gone there yet this round, you can start a worship for one of the gods. And when you do that, then you can take the action that God, you can take the strong version of the action that God allows. Similarly, if you wanted to do that action, but someone else started the worship first, you can then take a follow action, send one of your priests there, and then you get the weak version of what that god does instead. Now, the strong actions are all significantly more powerful, so you really don't want to spend very many of your priests doing follow actions. But there aren't enough actions on the board to allow you to only do the originating actions, and some of them are just better for your plan than others, so it's a mixed bag. But like Anachrony, the actions all need their own explanations separate from the process of playing the game. And like Anachrony, I should say Anachrony is like Olympus, because Olympus did it first. Those actions are separated from the rules, or from the phases in the rule book. So that's currently the way our rule book is, but we did have a number of readers who sort of said it would be really nice to have all this information in the middle of the action section. And ultimately, we just decided what we need to say is actions are explained on pages 5 and 6 of the rule book. And until we get a few more read-throughs and actually some blind playtests where people don't understand, I don't think I'm going to change that back. Because the other thing to remember is that a rulebook reader is not a player. They don't have the components in front of them. And some of the questions that rulebook readers are asking us are questions that don't make any sense if you have the components in front of you. For example, one of the things that somebody asked us was where the shapes come from, because we talk about the line cards having shapes. Well, if you have a line card in front of you, you can see that the shapes are there. So that sort of thing is really tricky to puzzle through. But the other thing that I think is tricky that I wanted to talk about today that has to do with the difference between the style of gamers is what different people give you in response to your rules. That hardcore gamers, people who play a lot of games, will often not only tell you what they don't like about the game, but they'll tell you how they think it should be fixed. And while those ideas are useful and helpful, they also generally do something that doesn't suit, like they don't understand why you've done things the way you do, right? That they might make suggestions for changes and you're like, yeah, we don't do that because of this. But that's not really part of the idea of playtesting. The ideal version of playtesting, and this is something I'm going to try to do when I playtest other people's things, which I'm doing more now as a kind of quid pro quo, I'm going to try to do a much better job of describing the experience I have and identifying the problems that I encounter, but not telling the designer how I think they should fix those problems. Just because I haven't done any of the other playtesting. I played the game maybe twice, and in those 2 times, that's the feedback I can give. So that's the challenge of the playtester's gauntlet for the hardcore gamer, is to not turn yourself into a designer or use your designer's cap when you're playtesting, because that's not what the designer needs. And as a designer, when you're having hardcore gamers test your game, it's a real balancing act to pay attention to what people think without forgetting your own experience in designing and playtesting the game yourself. Presumably by the time you're having other people playtest it, you've tried it a few times, maybe many times, you've experimented with it, and you understand kind of what it's doing. So when other people then talk about it working or not working, you have the context that they don't have in terms of the different elements. Now, casual gamers are going to give you different things. Often the issue with casual gamers is, one, I would say most people who are light to casual board game players don't learn the games at all by themselves. So this is a real challenge for blind play tests. Like, for instance, my wife, she plays a lot of games. She is definitely a gamer, but I would call her a light or casual gamer for 2 reasons. One, she's not interested in playing heavy games, so certainly in terms of her interest in what kinds of games she plays, it's light. Although I guess some people might call Gloomhaven heavy. I don't, but secondly, she never has to learn a game from anyone but a person. She doesn't watch videos to learn a game. She doesn't read rule books to learn a game. She learns games usually from me or from someone else that we hang out with who teaches us the game when we're learning a game. And so because of that, if I were to hand her a game with a rule book, she hasn't got practice in teasing out from rule books what's going on in games. That is an acquired skill that some hobby gamers have and many do not. So that makes actually the blind play test an extra challenge depending who you think your audience is. For us, our train game, we see a potential market for Chicago tourism shops. That because our game is targeted at being relatively inexpensive and will have sort of delightful Chicago style art on it, part of the goal would be that people might buy our game because they're touring in Chicago. If a souvenir shop has it and it's $15. But we would not want it to be unplayable from the rule book. But if it's a hobby game and somebody who's not a hobby gamer plays it, that's a real challenge. Well, I just arrived home and forgot to sign off. So I will use this opportunity to say thanks for listening. Pop on over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 to give us some comments on the show. And I will talk to you another time. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.